any objections. Okay, so today we'll be talking about bundle classes. This is something relatively newish in the Drupal ecosystem that we sort of stumbled upon, and it really fell nicely into a project we were working on. It helped curb a lot of would-be complexity in not letting certain refactoring spiral out of control. So without further ado, I'm gonna go into talk about myself just a little bit. Um, I'm Luke. I work for Penn State. I'm grizzled and very often grumpy. My favorite pastimes are yelling at clouds or project managers that might get close enough to me. Not really, sometimes. I've been doing Drupal for about 6-ish years. Started just at the end of Drupal 7, but mostly I've been on Drupal 8 plus in my career here at Penn State. Before Drupal, I was a Magento developer, doing e-commerce for a while. Before Magento, I was into Java. I was back during the applets era. So I've been dabbling with a lot of stuff for a long time. And before Java, I was actually a mechanic, got out of that industry. Now I'm a lead developer for the web presence of World Campus, www.worldcampus.psu.edu, and our slightly lesser popular student portal for World Campus. We see about 400,000 unique visitors to our site per month. There's a lot of custom code. I can't even begin to explain how much custom legacy stuff that is still around from even times before I started here. We're still supporting certain legacy designs that are literally 7 or 8 years old on our one site. So we have a lot of history here. The site's pretty massive. So getting into bundle classes, of course, there's going to be prerequisites. We'll have to know what an entity is. We'll have to know what a bundle is. To use these things effectively, you're going to have to be somewhat well versed in object-oriented programming. We don't have enough time in this hour and a half to dive into those topics, so I'll just assume that everybody's comfortable with entities, bundles, and basic object-oriented stuff. So bundle classes, if I had to describe them, I would say that they're a feature that let developers extend an entity class without having to worry about the overhead that comes with maintaining a full-blown custom entity type. So if all you wanted to do was add a method to a node, but you didn't want to take over access control mechanisms, you didn't want to write all of the handlers that are needed, you didn't want to come up with a new entity list builder for it, you didn't want to figure out how to plug this thing into the diff module, you didn't want to figure out the revisions user interfaces, bundle classes should let you do that without needing to take over a custom entity type, which comes with so much extra stuff that we probably don't want to do in a lot of cases. They landed in Drupal 9.3, which was roughly about the same time that we started talking about this migration project, which was really convenient timing wise. Under the hood, it functions just by swapping out the class property of a bundle. Typically that's done through hook entity bundle info alter. Just a couple lines of code, swap out the class. And like I said, these things are very low maintenance compared to custom entity types. Right now on our site, we have, I think, 4 custom entity types, and we're going to be retiring most likely 3 out of those 4 by transitioning over to plain nodes with bundle classes. So we can keep our wonderful API and pretty much just delete a bunch of custom code. So why bundle classes? Well, why bother if we have something that already works? They're just really good at encapsulating weird business logic. And I'll talk about weird business logic a lot. It's something we've probably all faced. They're unit test friendly, which is amazing. A lot of sites, the only way to really test functionality is to either go the route of writing functional or functional JavaScript tests or running tests against a live version of a site that's running. Testing this business logic in isolation is a major win, especially when it starts spiraling out of control. We can see them as a somewhat of a replacement for pre-processing hooks. We've used quite a few places. We've eliminated pre-process hooks and just replaced them with our API. They can replace questionable things that we've probably all seen in Twig and cringe at. We've probably all seen stuff like that going on in Twig. We can use these bundle classes in conjunction with pretty much anything that object-oriented architecture allows for. Interfaces, traits, using composition to pull in various interfaces. We can really build up an architecture around our business logic in ways that was really only possible through custom entity types before. Just as a quick footnote, Drush, it ships with a bundle class generator now. So generating all the boilerplate, and honestly, there's not much, can happen pretty quickly and pretty easily. So getting a little bit into this weird business logic stuff, I'll run through a scenario that we've hit on pretty much every project we've worked on, where we're not unique in this. We've all probably been here, but say we have a requirement that says display the node title. It's easy. You just type something in and it shows up for the page title. It shows up for breadcrumbs. It's the meta description title. And then 3 months later, somebody wants the breadcrumb title to be different from the page title. So now we add a page title override field, and we display that if it's set, and then we fall back to the other field. And that's great until 3 months later, some new requirements come, and now we have a tag that we need to check for in this crazy override chain. And there comes a point where it's going to become just unmanageable, and we need tests in order to make sure that this train continues to roll down the tracks. Testing in the old world with pre-process hooks, it's really painful. Generally they require functional tests, maybe functional JavaScript tests in some cases. And for anybody that's set up the CI/CD infrastructure, that's not a cheap thing to do. Oftentimes hooks are doing a lot of different things. They're not single responsibility. So, how can we be sure that we're really testing what we think we're testing? With bundle classes, we can conceivably move the subject under test into a kernel test to really test it in isolation. Bundle classes, like I said before, especially with business logic and weird business logic, becomes very convenient. So how do we get our business logic results into a template today? Do we bake the logic into Twig? With that, if this field is set, use it, else use a concatenation of those two fields and come up with this really messy giant Twig monster? Do we introduce new variables and preprocess hooks and basically take that logic out of Twig and move it into a procedural hook? Those are pretty much the two options we're left with. And I should stop here and say that we use a design system to render out most of the front end code that we see here on the World Campus site. So we really make limited use of field formatters and all of that stuff. We've found that they're just not quite flexible enough to meet our design needs. So we end up doing a lot of pre-processing, a lot of conditional logic to make things look just so in any permutation of configuration options that we're reading this data from. But with bundle classes, we can use an API to sort of encapsulate all of this stuff for us. We all know that Twig runs in a sandbox. Any public method on any object starting with the string get, you can call from Twig actually. So say you have a node that's part of the node, that's a variable passed to the node template. You can call any method that starts with get on that node object. So for example, there I just called node get page title. Get page title, a method on the bundle class, figures out all of the logic for us. And that means that any getters can be called from Twig. So stepping into our real world use case, when I started at World Campus, we were on Drupal 7. We had 200, I'm calling them program-like thingies because that is a pretty loose term. Each one of these nodes had an infinite cardinality title plus WYSIWYG field that we somehow used a series of views and hooks to take and make dynamic routes out of. So essentially you add a title and a WYSIWYG item, you get a new page out the other side. We did this with a lot of helper functions. We migrated these 200-ish nodes from Drupal 7 into custom entities in Drupal 8. Instead of that title WYSIWYG thing and the helper functions, we actually redid these with entity references. So each one of those title WYSIWYG things turned into what we called a subpage custom entity that was pretty much bound one-to-one with a program. That meant in Drupal 8 that subpages now had full editorial control over things like meta tags and a lot of things that a plain WYSIWYG just wouldn't let us do back in Drupal 7. This is a screen cap of the old subpage type system where we had tons of subpages. Content editors could add any number of them. They could contain pretty much anything. It was really hard for us to predict how these things were going to evolve. And another aspect of what we're working with is that we had certain fields and information bound to a program that we actually had to syndicate out to every subpage, either in the form of a block, a token, an extra field, It was really a mixed bag of how we had to inject this shared information from the central program hub into all of these subpages. In more recent times, we decided to take all of those 2,000-ish plus subpages and then squish them into like 200 single page app type, single page app like nodes, I'll call them. The new design, we really didn't have a need for any custom entity types anymore. A node really, it fit the bill. We had a list of things that nodes didn't make sense for when we were doing the whole program subpage relationship. That just all went away when we were turning these into a single page app. As we all probably know, changing entity types, it's not an easy thing to do in Drupal, especially when you have dozens approaching 100 other features that are relying on these entity references that had been set up. So this was a daunting task in front of us. Another thing that we figured we couldn't live without was the API that our custom program entity was providing. It was providing the same functionality as what bundle classes was, really added to fix. We had this rich API that encapsulated all of that weird business logic in a nice tight package. It was so nice that so many site features were relying on it, and we really, we really couldn't say we're going to rebuild the entire site for this, so we needed to figure something out. I have here just a image of the new single page app like thing with a link at the bottom if anybody cares to click that. Our custom program entity API, it had roughly 18 to 22-ish methods. These methods would come and go as new weird business logic dictated. And it worked out pretty well. We were able to use our IDEs to really track usage on this. Right click and find references. It worked amazing with these methods. We used the API in hooks, plugins, tokens, twig, field rewrites inside views, pretty much every place you could imagine. We were relying on this API, and it was working out great. We couldn't refactor the rest of the site, so along came bundle classes, and it was just an amazing timing feat that happened. Using bundle classes, we were able to provide the exact same interface as our custom entity type, but do it with a node. So really all we had to do was create the new single page app like thing, migrate the entity references, and the rest of the site just continued to work as it was. We didn't have to touch any of the other features that were relying on the API. So I have some excerpts up here for actually how we built out our bundle class. We started with an interface. It's always great to start with an interface. This is a little bit trimmed down. We found that some of the interface we were able to actually drop when we were moving to the single page app like things. In each one of these functions, I'm not going to get into the business logic behind them. Some of them are very simple. Some are pretty complex. Some of them we actually reach out and grab data from our CRM. So the data is not actually even stored in Drupal. After we figure out what the interface is, we have to implement the interface. The important bit here is that you're extending the entity type that you're applying the bundle class to. So in this case, our program class extends node. So our program is everything that a node is and more. And the and more comes from the program interface that we're implementing. In the example snippet, we can see that we're actually calling through to a service that reaches out to our CRM to grab information to display. You will notice that we are using the procedural Drupal service call. That's just a quirk of how this stuff works. As far as I'm aware, you can't. Dependency injection is just not best practice-y, at least not yet, as far as I'm aware. And believe it or not, we're almost done. The last thing that we have to do is just tell Drupal about the bundle class with a hook. Hook entity bundle info alter. Take the class property and replace the node class with our program class. And after we do this, every place in Drupal that we have a node object, it's actually going to be an instance of our bundle class. So within Twig, we can just call getNextDeadline, which calls through to our bundle class, which uses the service to grab info from the CRM. No pre-processing hooks needed. We can use it on a block. We have here is a block access method that actually will remove a deadline block from our site if the CRM says there's no upcoming deadline. And I won't go on to all the places we use this because, let's just say we can use it anywhere in Drupal. And that's it. That's bundle classes in a nutshell. We're using the same API for block types, personalization mechanisms we have set up, REST APIs, custom JSON LD structures for courses and program events. We have this thing integrated with certain web form element types to make our web forms a little bit more customized to the program that they're appearing on. So many custom tokens. We have Twig extensions that are using this. And we didn't have to refactor any of these places, which was awesome. So what more can bundle classes do that we didn't actually tap into? And this is going to be a really open-ended slide. They can literally change any public or protected behavior of the parent entity type. So if you want to implement some sort of access control on top of what node does, you can extend that. Just call through to the parent if you want to, if you want additive access control, or if node doesn't do what you want at your own peril, choose your own adventure. Could these be somewhat of a replacement for a computed field? I did a little bit of thinking on this, and the interop might not be all the way there, but this seems like a really easy way to provide a field-like thing from your API without actually going through the field API mechanism. So an example being all the information we're pulling from our CRM. Does this maybe give us a new way to think about entity reference type groupings when you're setting up an entity reference field and you're choosing which bundles are selectable? Do these bundles share any properties that could be represented by an interface? And are bundle classes compelling enough to get people to start replacing custom entity types? It certainly was for us. We'll get into a little bit of what I found to be bad about bundle classes, and really not all that much. Coming from a custom entity world, this is a huge step forward. Like I mentioned before, dependency injection doesn't quite work in the best practice way, but it didn't with custom entities either. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily bad about bundle classes, or if that's just a shortcoming in the entity system in and of itself. And since this is so much easier than custom entities, is this leaving us with enough rope to shoot ourselves in the foot with? It becomes a lot easier to do weird things. Overriding access controls, not something to take lightly. And does it encourage the weird business logic to grow? Just because it's easier to test, easier to manage. I've had marked a lot of my best successes by deleting lines of code. Does this make the argument harder to simplify requirements versus make them more complex with test coverage? And honestly, that's all I have for bundle classes. They seem to be a pretty simple feature, on their nose. Any questions about bundle classes from the group here?
So while folks are thinking about things they might want to ask, and you just want to note that we had a little bit of conversation about the wonders of, well, looks like we have one that popped in from Joe. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it. The question is, have you had issues with caching?
Oh, we've always had issues with caching. With bundle classes, nothing specific to the bundle classes themselves. It's usually been places that we've forgotten to add a cache tag to a build array, or we were missing a context. And that, I think, comes a lot with the territory of just being in so much custom code. And what's worse, a lot of times these caching related bugs only show up months later on production, as soon as somebody noticed one. But we've been able to track them down pretty quickly, pretty easily, and added the right tags and contexts.
So for the recording, I just wanted to highlight that Brian Osborne had written a comment that this topic is really interesting. He remembers reading about this feature a while back, and that it's great to see it sort of in a real world scenario. Luke, I'll build off of Brian's comment. Are there other places you're looking into where this might be applicable for things where you perhaps have overextended yourself in one area, and bundle classes might be a good fix to that?
Yeah, there's been one area, and that's regarding Layout Builder. Just in the past couple years, we've gotten really deep into the Layout Builder weeds with creating a bunch of custom block types. And a lot of these custom block types, we have a ton of toggles on them, and we're finding that we have some need of contextual awareness in some of these toggles. For example, we have one style attribute that says when you're syndicating this block type to this site, it shouldn't go over and be transferred. If we were able to sort of tap these to help us make our blocks more intelligent and contextually aware, so that they only show the fields to users that are relevant when they're adding a block to any specific content type, I think that could be a great use for these.
All right, we have about, thanks for the answer, Luke. I can definitely see that with block types and the messy feature sets, especially when you're working with Layout Builder. We have another question from Andrew Schooner, who asks, with experience with both custom content entities and now bundle classes, where would you recommend custom entities in the future? Follow-up question, is there a clear distinction and requirements that would guide you to one versus the other?
Yeah, I should take a step back and say that when we first dove into these custom entities, this was all the way back in 2018. The landscape in the Drupal world has shifted so much in the past, 6 years now, almost 6 years. I think the reasons for a lot of why we chose to go with custom entities, the community has solved in other ways. We have things like I think they're called storage entities module, which essentially does the same thing as one of our custom bundles. We didn't need all of the overhead that came with nodes. We needed them to do something special when they were viewed directly versus referenced somewhere. They didn't really need a front end implementation in the traditional node sense, but I think the contrib ecosystem is a lot more fleshed out than it was back when we made all these decisions. But as far as when to need use custom entities versus bundle classes, it really, I think it's going to fall down to how deep your needs are. Are you trying to build an API, or are you trying to fundamentally change how the type you're extending operates? That could be anything from access control to storage. Those types of things, I think, would lean more toward a custom entity versus trying to undo a lot of what Node, for example, does. So I guess to stop rambling and sum it up, if you want to add to an entity type, I would use a bundle class. If you want to alter or remove from what an entity type does, that's probably a little bit outside of what bundle classes were intended for.
And I'm going to give a couple more, a minute or so for any additional questions that come in the chat. Luke, I hear you might be attending DrupalCon this year.
Yeah, I'm about 2 hours from Pittsburgh, so I'll be making the drive.
Awesome. So for those who are attending, if you wanted to follow up with Luke, Luke, are you attending the Higher Ed Summit this year?
Yep, I'll be there.
Well, now you know where to find him. That's a great opportunity to meet with both Luke and other folks in the higher ed Drupal community. And let's say you have a aha moment after this. It's a great opportunity to follow up and make the best of DrupalCon week.
Yeah, feel free to reach out on Slack. I only bite project managers.
All right, I'm going to bundle this up and send everyone home to have their lunches. Thanks so much, Luke. You've shared the slides. I'll make sure it's attached to wherever the recording is. And I appreciate you putting together some slides and providing us some overview and technical details on bundle classes, because at least for me, this has changed everything on what I've approached. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Have a great day, everyone.
All right, take care, everyone. I'm going to be putting up the recording as soon as it's done, and we'll post it, I think, to YouTube is what we've traditionally done. So keep a lookout for it. Thanks so much, y'all.